make it clear.
Order.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my ever-revolving panel of bloggers and opinion shapers, she is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies and lectures at Massey Uni, blogger Phoebe Fletcher, and he is the editor of independent news site, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. Did the mainstream media's titify fetish manage to gloss over bigger issues on Waitangi Day? Issue 2. Is the government stacking the Human Rights Commission and turning our watchdogs into lapdogs? And Issue 3 tonight, does 7 Sharp represent a new low point in current affairs and Western civilization? Plus, we'll end the show on the final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. According to John Key's bash and dash speech at Waitangi, the reason Māori are being held back is because of activists like Titifai Harawira, which is surprising, as I thought that what was holding Māori back was all that land stealing and only paying back 1% of the value as reparations. When we have the highest inequality ever recorded and deepening poverty impacting many Māori, you would think that there were plenty of social issues to focus on during the one day of the year that we reflect on the treaty. What the media focused on, however, was Titifai apparently wrecking and bullying the nation. The New Zealand Herald even managed a Granny Gate reference. Phoebe, does the immaturity of the New Zealand media suggest that after 173 years, we still have a lot of growing up to do in regards to the Treaty of Waitangi?
I think it does. I mean, it was amazing to me how what Titifai was up to basically became the sideshow that stole the whole of Waitangi Day for the Pākehā media. I think Māori television had better coverage of Waitangi Day, but I think that this also revolves around news values, that, you know, when you have a kind of ratings-driven news model, something like conflict is actually going to generate more viewers, and they're appealing to essentially a Pākehā audience. So Sue Abel, Dr. Sue Abel, has written a really good book on Waitangi Day news coverage, and it does tend to focus in on the conflict, and this has been a characteristic that we've seen, you know, for the last decade, really.
Shouldn't we have grown up by now, though? 173 years and Titifai stealing and wrecking, that was the story.
I think so, but I think it's also down to, I guess, short deadlines for news and,
Right.
you know, perhaps personal bias in the reporters, you know, having a lack of history or knowledge around the issues. I mean, you know, I think that there were a few people there trying to say, Winston Peters came out, for example, and said, you know, what Titifai is up to is not the issue here. The issue is that we have 1/3 of Northlanders unemployed. And, you know, these are the sorts of issues that we need to be focusing on.
Yes, Selwyn, this is Machiavellian genius by National, isn't it? I mean, the government, since their water asset case in front of the Supreme Court isn't going to pass, John Key needs to start dog whistling, and the Harawiras provide the perfect fuel for that, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and also it gave the opportunity for John Key, obviously, to say we have a will, meaning the Crown has a will, the government has a will to settle, you know, grievance. But really, it was conditional, his message. You know, you as an iwi have to sort out your divisions before we can really sit down at the table. And it was almost like speaking to the heart of Mana's base, its electoral base up there where Hone Harawira obviously holds the seat. And then John Key is saying, you've got to be more like the Maori Party.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to be like the Māori Party. Come to the table, shake hands before the deal's done type of attitude here. And that's where I thought the Titifai angle played into John Key's agenda very well. It wasn't the other way round in the sense that John Key adjusted his speech. It was that basically that angle complemented him.
They're going to pick up some support, aren't they? I mean, you have you have a go at Māori activists. You can't not go up in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think in New Zealand, you know, it would be fair to say that if you scratch the scab of racism, there's going to be pus come out. We've seen it in the past, and it'll be in evidence again on this one. No doubt.
Phoebe, National have difficulty relying on their economic record to fight the 2014 election because, you know, their policies effectively empower the wealthy, and that's not particularly a healthy vision that people want to vote for, is it? Are we going to see more use of wedge politics by the government now?
I think we certainly are, and I think picking up on Selwyn's point, I mean, you know, John Key's speech was not pitched at Māori. If you look at the latest poll that came out on Māori, you've got Labour sitting on 34%, even though 63% of them don't know who the leader is. You've got the Māori Party there on 28%, and Peter Sharples was very clear on the fact that water rights was an issue that needed to be raised. And, you know, you saw the Tirewhai issue become kind of, as Selwyn says, a sort of wedge of, you know, what Suable would call the division into good Māori and bad Māori, or tame Māori and wild Māori. You know, when in essence, like if you listen to any of those Ngāpuhi elders, they were talking about how this kind of debate and discussion is kind of a fundamental part of Waitangi Day. This was a local issue that got platformed, you know, in front of the media.
One of the issues that was interesting earlier this week too was this sense that New Zealand First is certainly making a move into the region in the far north. You know, the opening of the office in Whangarei, for example, with Winston Peters' name above the door, is a signal that he sees that there are issues there that a conservative New Zealand First type of argument can pick up on. I think those are all making Waitangi very, very relevant, but from the political side. I thought mainstream New Zealand has missed out on the opportunity because of the failures of the mainstream press mainly to deliver a reality check on really what Māoridom wanted to engage with Pākehā on at Waitangi this year. Remember, it wasn't, for example, clouded with the malcontent from both sides that we had experienced in the past. So really it was an opportunity there, beyond a couple of individuals, to actually really have a look. New Zealand is a bicultural, it's the things that we celebrated this week, it's a bicultural nation that's founded on that treaty. Well, we didn't hear, if you were reliant on the mainstream, really what the Māori side had to say to us.
When can we celebrate Waitangi Day?
I think we celebrate it in ways every day of the year, in many ways, if you choose to. You know, in New Zealand, we have an ideal of fairness and justice that really runs through most people. There is an acknowledgement at every level of law that we rest our existence on a bicultural document. You know, these are things that we perhaps overlook most of the time, and it's expressed, for example, I saw yesterday in a vegetable shop, fruit shop, where a Māori woman was waiting to go through the checkout, but in front there was a person with a lot in the cart. And the Pākehā who was pushing the cart said, "Do you want to come through first?" Now, it was a sense of egalitarian regard for the person as opposed to an expression of division of race. And I think those things need to be celebrated in this country. But when it comes to putting the rights, the wrongs of the past right now, I thought the Prime Minister was playing politics with a conditional interest in trying to settle grievance, and that was awful.
When can we as New Zealanders feel that we can celebrate Waitangi Day?
Well, I think Waitangi Day is a very important day in our history, and I think we need to get rid of the perception that it has to be a happy day. I mean, for me personally, I am actually quite disturbed by David Shearer's calls for it to be more like Australia Day. You know, Australia Day seems to me to be something where, you know, Australians go out and get drunk and really don't acknowledge,
and they beat people up who don't worship the flag.
Indigenous history.
Fascist,
so I think that, you know, it should be a time for more education on these issues. It should be a time where we honour and we don't try to erase, if that makes sense. It should be a time for robust debate.
Do you think we try to gloss over it? That there is actually quite a large section of New Zealand population that don't want to be reminded about the land confiscations, the people not having an economic base to be able to build on, how that's fed into the poverty of today, that we don't actually want to acknowledge that?
I think that reflects some of the division in our politics anyway, really.
I think there's other things that it gives the opportunity where I would have loved to have seen mass public debate on was in the course of our lifetimes, and hopefully they're, you know, quite long ahead of us. What is New Zealand going to do about the Republic question?
Sure.
What involvement with Māori does the Crown need to do if it's ever going to consider that question sanely? What happens to the treaty? What happens to New Zealand's bicultural identity? Should it advance on trying to consider that question? These are things that are relevant. The current national-led government may not find those particular questions on republicanism relevant It has regressed us back to knighthoods and all of this type of nonsense from the old England days. But it's going to come back. You know, the Helen Clark years showed us that there was a popular will to advance that. And I would suspect that when there's a change of government, there will be a return to some of those things of adjusting back to New Zealand being a independent Pacific Island state type thing.
There was the suggestion, though, put out by John Key of a 4-year term. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and David Shearer seemed to endorse that if we take the reports thing. Well, on one side, you know, I think that's okay. It certainly gives stability and gives a term more of a party in government, a term with more opportunity to develop its legislative agenda. But on the other hand, you know, when you've got a country where more people by way of popular vote actually do not want a particular government, well, then you've got a long time to wait before you can do it.
New Zealand has one of the most powerful parliaments in all of the democracies because we don't have an upper house and we're just one chamber. You can read a bill straight into law. Giving them 4 years with that kind of power is quite a large jump, isn't it?
And I think there's some interesting debate that is occurring around this. Michael Cullen did a really interesting editorial where he also backed it. But Mai Chen has come out and said, you know, that there is a difficulty around the Treaty of Waitangi at the moment, that, you know, and that we're not really in the position to, I guess, assimilate these bifurcating views. You know, and this is something, I guess, Sian Elias as well has come out and said over the water rights that they are not, you know, that they potentially incur on Māori's rights to water. So I think, you know, there is a need for more discussion around that, but there is a body that is looking at that at the moment.
That's a great question to end on for this section. What happens? What happens if National lose their court case in the Supreme Court? What happens?
Well, I think, you know, it really is going to affect their platform. Obviously, but I think we're going to see, you know, more diversion of their politics into these sorts of dog whistle issues. I mean, it came out, you know, also this week that beneficiaries are the most discriminated against. So I think we're going to see an increasing diversion in terms of their political strategy to, you know, towards other issues before their upcoming election.
It'll be the Maoris are trying to steal the water. It'll be simplified down to that?
Yeah.
Will they just try to ram the legislation through for the asset sales?
Well,
an urgency?
Yeah, well, maybe. You know, that kind of scenario that gets on the courts support the Māori angle. It creates a very, very pressure vessel for National. It's got a limited term of stability from the Māori Party as it has its transition of leadership. I think that was some of the stuff that was in behind John Key's speech yesterday, and also it makes John Key's cabinet puts them into a position where they make decisions based on the pressure environment they're in, and we all know from history that when politicians do make decisions in pressured times, it's usually kind of strange.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, Judith Collins is facing questions over why she hushed up a relationship with a friend of her husband she appointed to the Human Rights Commission. This comes on the heels of appointments to the HRC by National of ideologues like Ken Shirley, Ravi Masuku and homophobic champion Brian Neeson. Selwyn, are National turning our watchdogs into lapdogs?
Well, this is the worry here, you know, and I guess it would be reasonable for the public to assume that that is the case. When you look at the evidence here, on that shortlist that was presented to Judith Collins as Minister of Justice, there was a person on there whose whole legal career has has focused on the human rights aspects of law. She's been well practiced in that area. She's had huge successes for the disprivileged and the disabled in the courts against the Crown and the New Zealand government at various times. Perhaps that went against it. She's also been a law commissioner specialising in human rights law. Judith Collins struck her off the shortlist. That was the first thing she did, was put a line through a name and said, out, not having that one considered here. So really you're starting to wonder, well, what is really driving, one, the inclusion of a name that is a person who is the friend of her husband and a family friend going back a long time, and why does that person get elevated above a person like that was struck off the shortlist when she was presented with a sheet of names? What is reasonable to assume here? You know,
meritocracy hasn't played a role, has it?
You know, you've got words like cronyism that start to come to the fore. Now, every political party, when they're in government, appoints people of their like. But family associations and friendships you know, you're starting to go down a creepy, slippery
And the
slope
Human
on
Rights
that.
Commission are one of those few departments who can make a ruling that the government have to listen to.
Yeah, well,
That is a lot of power.
It's supposed to be an independent body that's able to actually, and when you've got potentially the impact of some of the policies, like in the beneficiary area,
Yes.
that are highly represented by ethnicity and disprivilege, then human rights independence on a body that looks at it from the outside is vital. It's one of the safety marks and safety checks against the excesses of the policy direction we're currently on.
Phoebe, the Ombudsman's Office and the Office of the Judicial Conduct Commissioner have been so squeezed for funding they can't afford to bark. Where are our checks and balances?
I would have to agree with you here, and I think that you wrote a fabulous blog on this. John Armstrong was saying that he was shocked by the Ombudsman for the Official Information Act Office, Beverly Wakeham, who pleaded that they didn't really have much money. And picking up on what Selwyn is saying, I think there is a problem around this. I mean, you've got the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, David Rutherford, writing a recommendation for Catherine Rogers. Yet we get someone who is lesser qualified, Robert Key, appointed. And let's be honest and real about this. We are talking about very technical law. We actually need somebody who knows what they're talking about. So the person with the experience here should be winning, not the person that's friends with the husband.
And what you do in situations, what I think a lot of people do anyway, in situations like that, they think, is this a one-off or is there a pattern? Well, if you look at some of the appointments, you can see that there are problems, one being in New Zealand on Air type of areas relating to John Key's former campaign,
elected officer,
et cetera, et cetera. And you start to think, well, what on earth is going on here? Once again, all parties in government fall into this trap. This government is doing it too.
Yeah. Why are the watchdogs so important?
The watchdogs, well, they're basically brakes, I guess, on government, and there are people that are supposed to be making independent decisions. And I would agree with Selwyn. I think that there is a pattern here. I mean, you've had Paula Bennett bullying the Human Rights Commission before. We've also had, allegations about the New Zealand On Air Board over the Inside New Zealand Poverty documentary. So I think that there are serious questions around this that need to be asked. And the problem with this is that it also means for those people in those industries that they start to worry about their political alignment. Now, if we have people making decisions based on whether they're worried about if they will get employed within this political term, or they think that, in 2014, if up until 2014 I have to veer towards National, and then when Labor get in, I have to seem like I'm aligned to Labor, that's a problem. That should not be something that comes in as, a prerequisite for these sorts of jobs.
That's kind of making it sort of a little bit like the American system, isn't it? Do we want to get that partisan here?
Well, some would say and argue probably successfully that the Americans have got a much more egalitarian approach to kind of appointments in these particular areas.
Right.
When you've got congressional, oversight committees on this and that. But the 6 of one, half dozen of the other. New Zealand is falling into a trap here, which is deeper than I think I remember seeing and witnessing and watching politics for 20 years. It's a worry.
And yet it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you've got a government that is defanging the watchdogs as much as National are, if Helen Clark had been doing this, there'd be riots in the street. Yet John Key does it, and people sort of go, he's comfortable with that.
Yeah, and what's happening here too, like in a sense, the human rights area is almost, some would say, it's almost judiciary. And that is a concern. If people accept that, it's a concern from the independence and the need for independence in a democracy of having an independent judiciary and its various sub-quasi bodies, etc.
Final question on this then. I mean, with the Prime Minister's suggestion that we move to a 4-year parliamentary term, could we seriously do that when our watchdogs are so weak right now?
I don't think it's a good idea at the moment.
No, my gut instinct is, please do not. A look, viewers out there, a 3-termer at 4 years per term is 12 years. 3-termer at 3 is 9.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Speaking of watchdogs that have been defanged, TVNZ launched their new 7 p.m. current affairs show 7 Sharp. The new youth orientation is to capture the advertising demographic overlap from Shortland Street who has no airtime left to place advertising in. Phoebe, when marketing runs the news department, do we as citizens suffer?
I think we do suffer. I mean, what we've got clearly is, you know, an attempt to kind of capture a younger demographic, but it looks like after-school current affairs. You know,
why
it's
not
really
on
not.
two?
Why not on Channel 2, you know, perhaps? And I think this is one of the things that we've seen, you know, in the Your Views and the Herald, was this, you know, almost unilaterally negative feedback about, you know, the way that 7 Sharp was dealing with affairs, you know, and, you know, they had, you know, for example, the guy that suffered post-traumatic stress disorder in Afghanistan, and then you've got like this panel of people bantering and kind of giggling afterwards. It's perhaps not quite the right format.
You know, that point to me was one of the concerns. I'm not a broadcast specialist, you know, people know that, right? But looking at that, just from a watching point of view, one thing that I found was I don't have an attention deficit that I'm aware of, but I was struggling to hold my attention, or it was struggling to hold my attention through all that first show. The segue issues are really relevant, and I see respected people that know about broadcasting kind of showing concerns like Brian Edwards and others, you know, Bill Ralston and others commenting on segue kind of things. To me, they've got a problem. If they want to mix it up to being both serious, an issue that is as serious as what is the effect on the mental status of people, New Zealanders, that have gone into an offshore war zone, an offshore theatre like that. What's the effect on that? There's big issues here. And then it goes into some light banter and a light clip later. I think they've got to sort of, if you're looking at it too, and I'm thinking, what's the set trying to say to us? You know, I actually quite liked the look of it, but there was like a glass panel in behind, like a glass wall or something, and a big open cavernous room or hall behind it with no one in it. And you're kind of thinking, if they are trying to reach out and to touch and become relevant with a particular younger demographic on one, why have they got people that are much more aged than the demographic they're obviously clearly trying to seek?
But maybe it's aspirational. That big empty space is supposed to represent the third property that they're renovating.
Well, maybe they've obviously got room. But I thought, you know, Jack Tame obviously enjoying himself in the United States.
And a talent.
Wouldn't he connect to the demographic they're trying to attach to better than the seasoned and quality broadcasters they've put up in front of them?
They're probably trying to straddle two things at once and keep some of that remaining audience from homes. But I think if we talk about comedy news, we have had that intelligently in this country before. We've had things like Eating Media Lunch, which have actually dealt with things in a far more depth
where satire was sometimes hard to identify the reality of it.
Isn't there a slight irony that it's a show that's supposed to be youth orientated, and if you're looking at young people today, mass unemployment, they've got mass social issues that they're facing and confronting, debt issues with getting themselves an education, yet none of that seemed to filter through in terms of the content that 7 Sharp were using.
Yeah, I think, you know, that there is a kind of underestimation going on of, you know, the intelligence of young people that you've got going on with that show.
They're really stupid based on 7 Sharp. They're really dumb. Apparently.
But you know, a lot of the stuff is direct to camera. So it's not a conversation amongst the three of them, really. And I just felt that it was a bit preachy and a little bit directed and a little bit talking down from a school marmish and school fella kind of point of view. I don't know. You know, I'm obviously not that young demographic that they're after, but that's just the.
Well, neither are they. Well, let's wrap the final show with our show with the final word. Phoebe, your final word this weekend.
I'm really interested in this new book that is coming out by Jeff Bertram on the history of power in the world. And one of the things that his argument is that our power prices are twice in real terms what they were 30 years ago. Now this is 50% more than South Korea, and I think it was more than a third than Australia. And I think at a time when we are about to partially privatise our power assets, you know, Bertram's book is going to be a really interesting addition to that argument, because he is asserting it's because we don't have a watchdog or a regulator that New Zealanders completely overpay for power.
So the free market doesn't work again. What a surprise. Selwyn, your final word this week.
Today, it's 150 years since the Orpheus sank and was wrecked off the on the Manukau bar just off the coast of Whatapu there, and there are commemorations today. that took place, and there's also going to be different things that happen in Huia itself, where people can go and see some of the artefacts from that, the relics, etc., etc. And I think it's just a marvellous opportunity to remember something that was hugely significant all those years ago, but when you're out there at Wharapu, you can almost still hear it cry on the wind. It's poetic, and it's a wonderful day for that.
Why was it so significant?
Why? Because it helped to show just how movable and dangerous our coastline is. The bar had moved significantly from when it was charted. It showed how important it is that communication in times when people are in strife needs to be well advanced. All those reminders of things and readiness, responsiveness that we all kind of need to keep mindful of today.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, it's official! According to the Human Rights Commission, beneficiary bashing is our new favourite pastime next to property speculation and domestic violence. The hatred Paula Bennett has been able to whip up around beneficiaries has been special. Going on to Michael Law's Talk Hate radio show to chat about restricting DPB mothers and daughters from breeding was a charmer. Releasing the personal details of a solo mother who challenged her in public only to have to pay a secret settlement after the HRC reprimanded her for a privacy breach was inspiring, and Paula's ability to produce statistics that hide the disqualifications from welfare to suggest fewer people on welfare is a neat trick worthy of the mind freak Chris Angel. It all works politically because the working poor of New Zealand look at the pathetic hourly wage they earn and eye up the welfare check with envy. Rather than blame National for implementing far-right employment law in the 1990s that depressed wages to the paltry levels they are today, they buy into National's morality narrative and gleefully bash the beneficiary poor. Beneficiaries are too disconnected from the voting process to fight back, and so are an easy target. Doesn't matter if it's David Shearer and his fictitious Benny on the roof, or if it's John Key blaming poor people for getting groceries at food banks. Our love to grind, smash, crucify, torture, belittle, degrade, harass, spit on, urinate on, and crap on beneficiaries knows no end. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.